Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'd like to reiterate my gratitude to all of the supporters who made this exhibition possible and to all of our members and patrons who continue to support our many initiatives. So it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Xiaoze Xie to the stage to celebrate his exhibition, Heritage of Society, Objects of Evidence. For those of you who are not familiar with Xiaoze, he was born in 1966 in Guangdong province. He's very accomplished with multiple degrees, beginning with a BFA in architecture from Tsinghua University in 1988, followed by an MFA from the Central Academy of Art, and also another MFA from the University of Texas.
North Texas.
Yes, North Texas. So, to begin, I thought I would ask you, Xiaoze, you're very accomplished, you have had a very long and fruitful career, and if you could share a little bit with the audience how you came to visual art. I mean, you began as an architect. Take us a little bit through your formative years and what kind of set you on this artistic path.
Thank you, Michelle, for the kind introduction. I wanted to just take a moment to thank all my friends for coming today. I know that I have friends coming from Toronto, from Dallas, from Denver. Excuse me for not mentioning every place. And of course, I will take the opportunity to thank Michelle, you and your wonderful colleagues for enthusiastic support and tireless work for this project. I've been very excited about it. So, back to your question. Well, I started drawing on the floor spontaneously as a child. But when in my high school years, I was more focused on science and technology. And in fact, when I went through the entrance examination, the national exam, I was in the science and technology track. So you may call me like a 理工男, science and tech boy. However, in architecture school, I wasn't happy. I was aspiring for something much freer. And I was reading a lot of poetry and other forms of literature. I would go to draw and paint landscapes in weekends and holidays, and that's how I started as sort of an amateur artist.
Great. Well, and we can maybe begin with the slides. You began focusing your practice on books beginning in 1993, correct? Shortly after you came to the United States. And since that time, for over a quarter of a century, books have remained a central theme throughout your practice. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about, what your relationship to books are, and how you decided to kind of focus on that as a subject, and if you think that your relationship to books has evolved over time through to the present project that we have upstairs.
So when I was in China, I was experimenting with abstraction. And after coming to the States, I have looked into a variety of subject matters and try to figure out some new form of figurative art that has contemporary resonance. So in about 1993, when I spent a lot of time in a library as a graduate student, I was also at the same time learning photography. I look up at these rows and rows of books on the shelves. Something just captivated me. I think it was the form, it was the potential meaning of these objects that compelled me to raise up my camera and start to take pictures. And later I started to make paintings based on those photographs.
And here's some, we'll go back.
And so I
here.
started what was, I did not expect to continue series until today. It just continued to evolve, and I expanded my subject to include, not only Western books, but Chinese books and museum library collections.
I mean, and I think it's an interesting point to parse out. I mean, you began your Chinese library series in 1995, and just thinking about your background as an architect, I do find many of your paintings of books to be very architectural in their composition. And I feel also that, from our conversations in the past, where you've said that, while they seem like still lives at first glance, you don't conceive of them as a typical still life painter would. And in fact, you consider these as more found objects. So if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Exactly. I came up with I hope, a different approach. Is that I find these objects stacked as, find these objects the way I found them on the bookshelves and as organized by librarians. So I did not want to force my own kind of, order on these books.
Organizational rationale.
And so I want to capture the kind of atmosphere, the space atmosphere of that particular space, typically in a public institution.
I mean, and I think that there's a sense of temporality in many of your paintings of the libraries as well. I mean, it seems, you can think about the passage of time, you can think about the tactility of touch and the surface. I mean, this is a wonderful example, Through Fire, books that survived the anti-Japanese War of Resistance. So thinking about particular moments in time and the relationship that books and knowledge have at those moments, and kind of the need or the compulsion to protect these objects and the contents that they possess.
Well, you have said it all.
But maybe we could then think about, other elements about books that really drew you to this subject matter. If you want to maybe elaborate on this earlier work from 1995.
Sure. So as I continued to paint books in the mid-1990s, I was also very interested in history. I was also interested in what people have done to books. So I made paintings and installations based on specific historical events. For example, this piece is called Nocturne, Burning of Books by the Nazis. It's an installation from 1995. It is composed of 3 monumental drawings depicting the bonfire, the fire stacks that I took from a documentary film of Nazi Germany. On top of those 3 drawings, I superimposed 6 small paintings framed in gold, each one depicting a fluttering book. And then there's a grid of railroad spikes that penetrate the drawings and go into the wall, adding a kind of destructive elements. So that was the first piece, having to do with the destruction of books, or later it eventually leads to censorship.
And this is another example, slightly later from 1999, if you want to elaborate.
This installation is titled Order, or the Red Guards. So the image on the hanging scroll is based on a photograph from the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution, when this huge variety and a number of books were burned. So you see this, the floor of the library covered with piles of damaged books. And also you can see that there are these more orderly books on the bookshelves. This hanging scroll is marched over by 3 rows of metal plates. Each one is about this size, there's a considerable thickness, and most of them painted bright red using automobile enamel, something very, industrial and, very cold.
And so let's fast forward now to 2014. And so during this time, you received a residency. You were able to take a residency at Peking University in Beijing. And that's where you first became interested in the body of work that is featured upstairs, of looking at the history of censorship in China. If you could tell us a little bit about how you became focused on this subject in particular, and how you began kind of the research and exploration to develop the body of work that we see today. And I'm going to pass this to you so you can elaborate,
So this is the bench?
Yes, so this one is going forward and the red one is backwards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll start with this image of the photographs. First of all, well, the idea I had the idea in 2012 when I was reading a book called A Brief History of Banned Books in China, and so I wanted to do a project focusing on that history, and so through a lot of reading and research, I started to compile a long list of books that have been banned in both pre-modern times and modern times after 20th century. And so I set out to locate these titles in public collections. I was able to find some early editions in the collection of Peking University Library and Fudan University libraries. So all the photographs that I've seen up in the gallery are mostly from the collection of these two institutions. For modern books, I was able to collect them, to acquire these antique books from the internet, from used bookstores, and it took a long time for me to,
almost a decade up to now, yes. Well, back to scrutiny and this series of photographs. There's 30 photographs that we have included upstairs in the galleries. These works are no longer censored. And I could say probably, pretty much all of the literature and the publications that we have in the gallery are no longer censored. But at the time that they were published, they were, deemed very provocative and, dangerous in some cases. And so I'm curious, these books went from being, reviled and kind of shut away to now being in some cases revered. I mean, we have some classics that you've depicted here, which you can talk about in more depth. But what was it like to access these materials? If you could kind of share a little bit about, these books are housed in these very kind of esteemed universities now, and so it's a very dramatic shift from kind of, this very kind of maligned material to something that is held in such high regard.
It wasn't easy to gain access to these books, and I had at times I was frustrated not being able to talk to the right people. So these have become relics, obviously, and there are some of them are treasures, treasures of a particular collection. So I had to go through all the bureaucracy and talk to the leadership in order to have access. So it was a process of negotiation. And for me, it's a fascinating learning process. I did not know a whole lot about ancient, Chinese literature. And so you want to look at some of these titles. So in the middle row, as I mentioned, up in the gallery, there are works banned for philosophical reasons. For example, these two titles, these two images on the left, is called Changshu, which means a book to keep hidden. To the right is a book to burn. So these are two philosophical works by Ming Dynasty philosopher Li Zhi. From these titles, you get a strong sense that he was aware that these books were not acceptable to the authorities, not to the norm. And so I included these provocative titles in the installation. I would like to mention the dialogues between different titles, the kind of intertextuality. So on the bottom row, to the left, I have images of the Peony Pavilion, well-known Ming Dynasty tragic comedy. To the right is The Tale of the Rock, also known as The Dream of the Red Chamber. And so there's an interesting dialogue between the two. In The Tale of the Rock, which is a later work, there's a scene in which the young protagonists read the Peony Pavilion. So this scene here to the left is 牡丹亭宴曲锦芳心. Translated into English would be love songs from the Peony Pavilion awaken a tender heart, or move a tender heart to anguish. How beautiful. And so you can see this development of a kind of literary tradition in different titles.
Mm-hmm. And I think that intercontextuality continues in a very beautiful way in your objects of evidence installation. So it would be great to hear some of the connections that you've made between these periods. I mean, these are works these are books collected for your own personal collection, and up to now I think you have over 750 titles or so. Yeah. So quite tenacious.
Yeah, so at the gallery we have briefly introduced these 3 vitrines, each one focusing on a particular period. So the one to the left is focused on the Republic era from 1911 to 1949. The second one focusing on the early years of the People's Republic of China, the 1950s. And then the third one to the right is about the Cultural Revolution. And you will look at these titles and carefully examine these, different books. There are also dialogues between the different objects. For example, in the Republic era, Lu Xun was a highly influential left-wing writer. And in the second, on the lower level, you notice that there's a long list of books banned during his time, placed on the second layer, and that's what I use as reference materials to collect those books on the first. And if you are able to recognize his face, then in the second vitrine you also find Lu Xun's portraits. These are works by later, younger authors who were influenced by him, paying tribute to Lu Xun. The one to the right is by Xiaoze Xie. So you can see this
the 3
dialogues.
Various periods over time. I mean, and I think that really speaks so eloquently about the subjectivity of censorship and how over time shifting socio-political values may be very fluid, and so what may be reviled or what may be considered objectable at one moment is not always a constant.
Right, and sometimes it's all opposite. Like what was banned during the Republic era will be elevated after 1949 to the most important works.
And do you find that through the course of your research of these censored titles, obviously some, like The Dream of the Red Chamber, have gone on to become, revered classics, but for the most part, many of these books that were very objectionable, are they more obscure now, or what's their status kind of in the contemporary time or in subsequent times. Have you noticed any kind of patterns or trends in terms of, looking from one period to the next?
Well, I am not exactly sure what the question is.
Well, I think just broadly speaking, when you were doing research, let's look at these three vitrines in the modern era. So from the Republic period to the 50s kind of anti-Hufang clique period, to the Cultural Revolution period, did you notice specific trends in terms of shifting values that, would dictate the types of material that would be censored?
Yeah, I do notice
or
that
would have fallen off that
there are recurring
band list.
themes,
Yes.
recurring themes, and the patterns of control, certain types of works. For example, writings about history is always a highly risky territory. From pre-modern books, for example, there are many books written in Qin Dynasty about the transition from Ming to Qin Dynasty were banned because the Qin Dynasty rulers did not like works that express a kind of, feeling for the previous dynasty. And for the same reason, writings about, Republic era, about early years of the Republic, could become dangerous. For example, there's a contemporary book, Ye Yong, there's anti-rightist movement whole story. I interviewed the author. You can watch the documentary film. And it was banned for the same reason that those Qin Dynasty books were banned, on the same grounds.
So in the same way, there are similar patterns maybe that repeat themselves over time.
Exactly. And you look at the erotic works, they've always been popular over time and always banned over and over again.
And I think there are some foreign titles as well. And so thinking about kind of foreign influences in maybe certain periods that were controversial, bringing in new ideas.
There are a lot of Western classics, world classics, they were banned during the Cultural Revolution. And I've included some of those. There are some familiar titles you can perhaps recognize. Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, The Gadfly.
Tale of Two Cities.
Tale of the Two Cities. And there are, you can find lyrical poetry by Pushkin, by Byron, and then there are other novels like Don Quixote.
So I think you might have, we can talk a little bit about the 50s era, because I think it can speak to your collecting in terms of the vitrine from the 50s and kind of thinking about a certain group of art, writers and their influence.
So in the 50s, the milestone of book banning is the campaign against Hufeng anti-party clique, so-called. And for me, it's a fortunate case in terms of research. I came across this document, this notification from the propaganda ministry, which has a list of works by the members of the so-called anti-party clique, 19 authors. And I was able to collect like 18 works by 18 authors out of the 19.
And I think, it would be interesting to note as well that the extent of your research has gone beyond just this kind of visual archive of formerly censored materials, but you've also really done in-depth research, and upstairs we have a searchable database that is interactive, and maybe if you could share a little bit about the motivation behind digging into the material even deeper that way, and allowing visitors to kind of, take a deeper dive into the material, and maybe a little bit about the process of how you developed this program, because it's very ambitious.
As I developed this project, I've written up proposals for exhibitions, and because this vast history of book banning, this huge variety and numbers of books, I always imagine an immense space with a grid with hundreds of photographs, long tables displaying hundreds of titles. Of course, each time you always deal with a specific space. We do 4 victrines, 3 victrines, either 300 books or 200 books, 13 titles out of 118, so on and so forth. So I wanted to come up with a way that allows me to represent the variety and the continuity of that history. And I also want to create a more interactive experience. I have visitors who complain to me personally, say, we want to touch those books,
Sure,
we want to flip through them.
They're very tempting.
Yeah, so I think a searchable database is a good solution. It allows the viewer to search certain titles without really opening up those antique books. And I think we've done something new. For this exhibition, to your credit, is to stage this table with some accessible books, selected examples from those displayed in the vitrine. So in the database, I try to organize these different titles according to some logics. In the pre-modern section, I organize them based on the reason of banning. Like some according to 4 main reasons, some were banned on political grounds or philosophical grounds, religious grounds or moral grounds. But in the modern section, 20th century history, I feel like it makes more sense to divide them according to periods, because each period has a very specific kind of character, and there's a political trend, there's a milestone event. So I feel like I need to have some flexibility instead of applying one rigid rationale to organize these materials.
And just thinking a little bit about your personal history, because you were born in 1966, the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Obviously, that was a very particular moment in Chinese history, and thinking about the government's, kind of approach towards education and the dissemination of information. From your childhood, were there elements of your memories or your recollections that kind of influence this consideration of this subject matter?
So during the Cultural Revolution, I was actually, too little to remember a whole lot. My direct experience or memory was very limited. So when I make works about the Cultural Revolution, I think it's more based on a collective memory related to what I have read about that period. But I do have some memories, huge parades and propaganda paintings, slogans, things like that. There's one particular thing that stuck in my head was that when I think I was around 10 or so, my father was director of teaching at a high school, and so I one day in his office I saw these piles of old books accumulated in his office, and later I learned that those books were what people were urged to turn in. These were the olds, right? Like books that were considered feudalist, harmful, and those were waiting to be destroyed, I learned. I was very curious. I got a strong sense that this is something mysterious and dangerous. But I didn't know exactly what was going on. I only learned about it later. So that might have planted some kind of seed for the future.
But I do think, and I think you might have an image of it, but during that period, I mean, I think you have some great examples of how people, in their search for knowledge or their kind of tenacity to have access to materials, they had handwritten books, or thinking about different ways of controlling information or kind of distributing information. I mean, if we could talk a little bit about the books in that section, like the handwritten books or the gray and the yellow bound books, and those categories in this period.
Yeah, so we talk about the handwritten copies in the gallery. You can see those handwritten copies in different forms juxtaposed with later publications. And there's also an interesting category during the Cultural Revolution is the publication of gray cover books and yellow cover books. And that started from, I think, from the 60s all the way to the end of the Cultural Revolution. And it continued, I think, for at least 2 more years. I found some gray cover books or yellow cover books published in 1978, as late as 78, 2 years after the Cultural Revolution. So these books are usually marked, they're very plain, right? They have a plain cover.
Very nondescript, yeah.
Right, and so usually there's a note there. They are marked with internal reference only or internal reading only. So the access is limited to government officials and researchers at cultural institutions. However, these books would become influential among young readers.
And are they widely available now at this moment in time? These kind of gray cover books or yellow cover books, are they easily accessible, or are they?
These books were printed at a limited number, with limited circulation, and they were influential at the time. And nowadays, people don't really read those. There are some. A lot of them are in translated works of Western literature, modern literature particularly. And so in the past few decades, there are many later publications of those same titles.
Sure.
Yeah, and then they become very popular.
And so since this is an ongoing body of work, I'd be curious to hear more about the direction that you would like to take with this body of work. I mean, you've explored it in a number of mediums and have kind of been very thoughtful in how this material existed and kind of its legacy. But I guess if you could talk a little bit more about how you would like to move the project further, or kind of other thoughts that you would have that you would like to explore with this material. I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, it is an ongoing project, and I'm still very passionate about it. I will continue to collect books from different periods and expand the project in scale. And I think it's far from finished. I'm also thinking about, not only books, but perhaps films, theater productions. The issue of censorship is not only limited to books, obviously.
Sure, of course.
We can talk about TV, movies, TV, magazine, newspapers, internet, and so it becomes a very big topic.
A broader platform to consider. And I mean, I think some people may, on first glance, say, this is Chinese literature, I don't understand Chinese, I can't, access the material. But I think obviously, it's a very timely subject, and I think it has more universal resonance. And so for somebody who maybe isn't knowledgeable about Chinese literature per se, or that speaks a language, what would you like them to take away from the work? Or what would you like them to glean from the works upstairs?
Well, I hope viewers visitors would do both, like looking and reading. And by reading, not only reading the labels, reading, some of the text, but also, reading into the work, coming up with their own interpretations, and perhaps draw comparisons between the Chinese examples and examples from their own culture, Western culture. I hope at least they get this the sense of the vastness and the continuity of censorship, of the control of thought. They will get the sense of visual variety. As an artist, I hope I am telling the stories with objects in a very tangible, a very concrete way, with all the texture.
Sure. And I think you made an interesting comment earlier today when we were having our conversation, where you were thinking about, that these books, they really embody this unorthodox thinking that challenges the status quo. And so it's really kind of thinking about these books as cultural outcasts. And so maybe if you could explore that idea a little bit, and
yes.
that their function as cultural outcasts and how they push society.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes I'm asked by friends or visitors why, first of all, why books and why banned books, right? So I think a banned book is a battlefield. It's a site of a power struggle. And a banned book is where politics, society, art, and literature converge. And that's why it's so fascinating. And among this huge amount of banned books, we can find, like you say, unorthodox thinking that challenges existing orders. Sometimes you find mysterious belief systems. You can find courageous protests, alternative histories, intense human emotions, perhaps the desire, pleasures. So there are so many layers to the subject of banned books that would continue to hold my attention. And I think what I'm trying to do here through art, through installation, is to do the reverse, this process of reverse. I want to bring what has been put into dark back to light, to remind everyone what could easily be forgotten.
And which instead should be cherished, I guess, and championed, right? So, well, Xiaoze, thank you so much for your generosity of time and for the beautiful works on view. Please take the time this evening or come back if you are not able to stay to, peruse through the works and to sit through the documentary. The documentary video, I think, gives great insights into your process and also, has some very insightful conversations with some contemporary writers and critics. And so please join me in thanking Xiaoze for his time and insights, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.